Great. So I will be teaching React hooks. So what are hooks? As the name suggests, hooks allow us to hook onto function components, that is React features. So what do I mean when I say hook onto? When I say hook onto, I mean gain access to. And what components? We can gain access to state, or we can gain access to any lifecycle components. Lifecycle components will be further taught ahead in this course. But now we have heard everyone say state for a lot of time. So let's jump in and see what state is first. Well, think of it as a built-in React object, and you can basically use it to keep track of any data that you have throughout your application. It is basically an instance of the React component class, and it can be used with function components, and we can make use of hooks for this. So going back to hooks, we basically gain access to React features, and because of this, class components are generally no longer needed. However, we can note that there are no plans to remove classes from React, and hooks were basically added to React in the version 16.8. Now, before moving ahead, you need to know the significance of hooks. Why am I using this hooks? Well, the first point is you can share stateful logic between components. What I mean by that is, think of two components. They're fetching the data, they're sorting the data, and then they are rendering the data. But they are getting the data from two different data sources, which is why we cannot reuse this logic. However, with custom React hooks, you can basically extract this logic and reuse it. The next point is you don't have to worry about the this keyword anymore. Classes confuse both people and machines. This sentence is from the React documentation itself. And when it comes to classes, we have to use the this keyword. But when it comes to React hooks, it all becomes simpler, and you do not have to worry about that at all. And also, it is easier to decouple the logic from UI, and you can separate both of them. Before moving on to actually looking at some of the hooks and writing them, you need to know that there are three rules for writing React. They can only be called inside the function components. You cannot use class components. That is the first rule. Second rule is you need to call them at the top level of any component, at the start of the component. And the third rule is hooks cannot be conditional. What I mean by that is, if you're calling a hook inside any conditional, then it may or may not be executed. And since React always executes your hooks in an order, and if one of the hooks may or may not be executed, then React will complain about it and throw an error. Now, some hooks in React are the useState hook, the useEffect hook, the useRef and useReducer, and we will be looking at some of the main hooks. The first hook is the useState hook. The React useState hook basically allows us to track the state in the component. State was something which we saw on the previous slide, and it refers to the data or properties. And the useEffect hook, well, as the name suggests, it allows us to perform the side effects in the function, and the name itself hints towards this. Side effects are when we need to reach into the outside world, like fetching the data or the API. Now, before we go on to this third hook, the use context hook, I'd like to show you the implementation of this use state hook and the use effect hook. Okay, so I hope that's visible. All right.
Yes, it is.
So what do we have here? Yeah. So basically what we have here is I have just took a couple of buttons and the zero displayed. Now, before using the use state hook, we will have to import it. So I'll import the use state hook from React, use state, and now we will create a state. So how do we do this? So first think of use state as just a function, and we will pass in the default state. This parameter is basically the default state that we takes in, and then we can have it copied onto an array. But this generally is not the way to do it. So what we would instead do is, since this useState function, it will return us two things. It would return us the state that we can call as count here, and it will return us a function to set this count, which we will call set count here. So this count would be basically the default state at first, and then we'll have this function by which we can update this state. So let's first print out this original state onto our screen. I will save this, and you can see 4, which is the default state, got printed out. Now I'll show you how to update the state using the set count. We'll add in an on-click listener here, and we would pass in a function that we would be creating shortly. Okay. So let's create this function. Function decrement count. What we would do here, we'll set the count to count -1. Save this, and we will see if it's working. Yeah, it works perfectly fine. However, this is not the most efficient way of setting the count. Now, why is that? Suppose, for example, I duplicate out this code And what you would expect here to happen is you would expect to let it be decremented by 2 since I'm calling it twice. But in reality, let's see if this is what that happens. This is not what is happening. It is still decrementing by 1. So why is that? Basically, this count is the state that we set here. So every time it will just take the original state and it will do 4 minus 1 here and 4 minus 1 here as well. That is why we get 3 and 2 and so on. So this would just override the existing set count that we do here. So a better way to do this would be passing in a function. So we can pass the function as such, which would take in the previous count and then do previous count minus 1. So let's see the functionality is the same. Functionality is the same. And now when we duplicate this, get back to the original state. Okay, now we can see it is being decremented by 2. Perfect. Now let's have an increment function similarly. On click equals increment count. Create a function as well for that. Similarly, this will call the set count function, and this will set the previous count equal to previous count plus 1. Hang on a minute. Let's see if that works. And it works well. So now we have seen how we can get the state and how we can update it as well. However, I'd like to show you a few things. This we have hard coded the value. This is generally not the most efficient way of doing it as well, because think of something. We are using a simple counter here, but suppose if you wanted to calculate the Fibonacci sequence, for example, then every time we would be calling this 4 value, and the application in general gets very slow. So you could do something like pass in a function here to initialize this. So I could do something like console. I'll show you how it is printed first. It ran once. So this function is always runs just one time, and that is why it is more efficient. Now, if I inspect my console here, you can see it ran only once, and even when I update the state here, it is not running. So a better idea would be just to pass this function, and you can create a separate function for this out here. Function initialize, we can call it. And print. And then you can just pass in this function. So this will make our application better since we are just this function runs just one time and not every time it renders, every time our state is updated. So this would be a better way of passing in the use state. As we can see, we get the same output here as well. It runs once, and even when we are updating the state, it does not run again. We are setting the state only once here. So that is the most efficient way of doing it. Now we can move on to the use effect, and I'll show you another implementation of this. But currently, let's implement this right here. Let's talk about the use effect hook now. So what the use effect does basically, just a minute. Use effect. This would take in a function, and that function would run when anything changes. So what changes? What changes do we need to affect? This is where the second parameter that you can see here comes into the picture. This is an array, and whatever you want to write inside this, basically when that changes, the function assigned use effect, this arrow function, that would basically be executed whenever this changes. So for that, I'll create another state just for that. Let's create, for example, a color and set color. Oops, okay. And I'll set it equal to blue initially. And we'll also display it onto here. It's being displayed here. Okay, now use effect, I want to do it whenever the color changes, and the effect that will initially have just console log something. Okay, so I'll console.log color changed, but I'm not changing the color. So let's change the color when we are pressing the increment button. Okay, so I'll set the color to red. Let's see how this works out for us. I'll refresh. Okay, now whenever I press the increment button, the color got changed, and you can see inside the color, you can see inside the console that we got color change printed out once. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm passing in parameter here and it changes. Now, what do you think will happen when I remove this parameter? Will this totally stop working or what exactly would happen? Well, you can put it in the chat box and I'll read on later. But if you guess that this would basically crash or something, it's not a bad guess. I would have guessed the same. But it doesn't happen that way. So the reason is when you're passing an empty array, it basically means that whatever effect you want to have that you're calling inside this function, this will happen on mount. Now, what on mount means? It means basically when the app is getting inserted into the DOM, it is being mounted. Don't worry if that doesn't make a lot of sense. It will be explained to you later when the lifecycle component comes up. But for now, all you need to know is it will be called on mount. And then as if I refresh, you can see that it will be called only once and not just when the state changes. Now let's create another implementation of this so you can see it better. This out for now. Okay. The objective here is we'll create a state first that will basically be our current window width, and then we would call a function to set our window width. Window, just a minute. We would be using the use state hook that we learned before, and we would set it equal to the window dot inner width. Okay, as such. Just a minute. And then we'll display this state first. Let's see what the current window width is. Give it, and we can see it is 127. Now, if I change this window width size, the change is not immediately being reflected on. But if I refresh it, then it is being reflected. So I do not want this. What I want to do is when I'm mounting this app component, when I'm inserting it into the DOM, I will basically want to add an event listener that listens to this resize event. Whenever I change the resize event, I want it to listen to it and update our this window width state and reflect it onto the screen. So I would accomplish that with the use effect hook. So what use effect would do this time? Yep. If you guessed that we would be adding event listener, that is correct. So what I would do is window.add event listener. We wanted to handle the resize event, and let's call in a function handle event. Now we haven't defined this function yet, so we will do that quickly. Const handle event. Just a minute. So what we want to do, we want to set the window width to the new resized window width. Set window width is window dot inner width. That is, whenever we are resizing it, we will want to set it. As simple as that. Now let's see if that works for us. And we can see whenever we change this. Okay, I think it would be better visible if I take it out. Whenever we change this, it is immediately being reflected onto our screen. Perfect. The last thing I would like to show you for use effect hook would how we can clean up the code. So what happens is when on mounting we are adding this event listener, and if the component is unmounted or deleted for some reason, then our add event listener would still be there and we want to clean it up. So in use effect it is super easy to do that. We can just return a function here like this, an arrow function, and in here we can just remove the event listener, window.remove event listener, and we'll pass in the same parameters as before, and we can just remove this. It is hard to see this in effect, but it happens. Okay, so this was all for the use effect hook. Now let's move on back to the presentation, and I'd like to go up ahead and start with the use context hook. But before that, I'd like to explain the concept of the different types of state that you have in your React app. So basically there will be four types of state. You will have the local state, you will have the global state, you would have the server state and URL state. So by local state, I mean the state that we can manage in any particular one component. And by global status, it is managed across your entire application. You can access it anywhere in any point of your application, and you can change it. So basically across multiple components. The server state is just the state that you get from an external server, and a URL state is all of the parameters that you can get or the path name that you get in your URL that is there. Now, we would be focusing on how to manage this global state in React. And there is a way of doing so using the context API. But before we do that, let's see why do we want to do that and why we are using this use context hook. So basically what happens is there is a way of doing global state management. How you do it is basically you take in the parent component, pass in the state, and you nest it. You pass it on along to the other state, then to the other state, and reach on to your final destination. That is, however, not the most efficient way of doing that, and it is called something as prop drilling, which we can see here. As you can see, there is our function component 1, wherein we are passing the user as the state, and then we are passing it on to the component 2, the component 3, and let's assume that our component 3 is the destination state. And component 2 didn't have anything to do with the state, yet it had to be passed because simply it was in that hierarchy. So a workaround around this can be using something called the context. Context, you can think of context as a global state. It is, you can just entirely bypass this hierarchy and access this global state at in any component. And basically this is achieved using a use context hook, which gains access to that context state. So now returning back, the use context hook, the third hook that we can see here, it will make that parent component data available to the child components at any level in the hierarchy without exposing it as props data. So basically you can bypass the hierarchy. You don't need to worry about the chaining that we saw before, passing it from component 1 to 2 to 3. You can just use it directly wherever you want. So let's see how we can achieve that now. Okay. So I have already created a context for us here in a helper folder. There is no such convention that you need to create it in a helper folder, but I like to organize it as such. And let's see at our context.js. So you need to import the create context from React. And we have created a new context here called login context. In this file, you can define as many contexts as you want. It can be a user context or any context. But why are we defining a login context here? Well, if I log in onto one page, I want to gain access to this login status in my other components, in my home page and my profile page. Think of it that way and relate it to a real life example. So the way to create is we call the create context, and we are passing in an empty object here. Since all we would be doing is checking whether we have logged in or not. It's a simple Boolean, yes or no answer. So let's move on back. Let's comment this out as well and start a new application. So what do we have here? We basically have here, I'll be showing you. Okay, so we simply have three components. There is a home page component, there is a login component, and there is a profile page component that I will show you. This is the home page component, then the login component, similarly just with just a button, and the profile component, and all of these come together in the app component wherein I've just called these. So now we need to firstly import our login context from the one that we created, the file that we created. So I'll write login import login context from, okay, / means basically we want to look in the same folder, same src folder, and we would choose helper, and then we would choose our context. Okay, now that we have imported it, the next thing to do is, do you notice why we are in this app component? Because it is the parent component which is calling all the children. So what we would want to do is we would want these all children, the one where we need the access to the state that we will be creating, these home login profile. For these components, we need to wrap them around in a login context provider like this. I would login context provider, and this would take in a parameter of value. So what value is? Value is basically the state that we would be creating, which we haven't created yet. Let's go ahead and create a state which would denote our logged in status. Logged in and set logged in. Okay, let's currently set it to false. So it's false, and we would pass in this as a JavaScript object, the same state that we created and the function along with it. Okay. So now that we have wrapped in, we would be getting access to this state that we created in all of our components. So how do I get access to this in my login component first? Okay, I would firstly have to import it again, like we did in our app.js. Okay, imported. And what we need to do here is we need to get access to the logged in state that we created. Now, how do you think we would be doing this? Would we be creating a new state like this? Or would we be getting the older state as well? So if you guessed that we would be creating an older state, I'm beginning to sound like Dora the Explorer now, but we would have to get an access to the old state that we created in our app.js. So notice the curly braces here because we are getting access to the old state, and we would be this what I'm typing in right now basically needs to be exactly the same way that I typed in here. So if you're not sure, you basically can just copy paste it. And we here the use context hook comes into picture, and we would be passing in the login context that we created. Simple. Now, if I want to show this out onto the screen, I would basically just perform a simple check here. Am I logged in or not? Remember that we first set it out to be false. So if I'm logged in, this is the syntax of a ternary operator. So if you're not familiar with, I'll be explaining as I write it out. So yes, you are logged in. This would be displayed. However, if I'm not logged in, the content after this colon would be displayed. When you are not logged in. Okay, so what the ternary operator does is it basically performs a check. If I'm logged in, it will check if it is true, then it will display this. If I'm not logged in, it will display this. And since we set this to false first, we would be seeing that you are not logged in, which is what we see here. Now, what I further want to do is when I click on this button here, I want to change the state to you are logged in. And you can notice here that we have accessed the global state in our login component, which is pretty cool. Okay, so now we can just add in an on-click functionality here that can change the state. Now I'll save this and we'll go ahead. And if I click on this, we get yes, you're logged in. Now let's access the state and our rest of the two components as well. Now, since you have understood this so far, this is going to be pretty easy. The way we declared the logged in state here, we will be doing exactly the same for our profile. And let's do it first in the home component. I will copy this onto this. And I'll remember to import. Let's copy the import as well. And let's display it out like we displayed it out here. So that's super easy. Hit save and we could be able to see yes, you're logged in. Similarly for our profile page, we would do the same thing. Import, copy the state and display. That's it. Did it right now. Let's copy the state as well. Display. Okay. So that is pretty cool. And now if I refresh, yes, I'm able to see that you're logged in all the states. Let's revert it back to original condition. You're logged in. If I click here, you can see that we can access this one state that we created in all of our components using use context and the context that we created. So it was pretty cool. The last thing I'd like to show is that if I add in the login button here, that is if we can change the state from another component as well. Well, you can do that. The answer is definitely yes. Let's add in this functionality to our home. And click here to log in. Okay. You can see the button appeared, and if you're not logged in and if I click here, then you can change the state from anywhere. You can see that the state changed, and you could change the state anywhere. So that was it for use context, use state, and use effect. So to sum up, what we had was initially use state hook is basically used to create a state. And use effect is basically used for a side effect. Whenever anything changes and you want it to trigger some sort of effect, then that's when use effect comes into the picture. And use context is basically used to create a global context in which you can access the different states anywhere throughout your application. So that would be it from my side.